There is a particular kind of confusion that arrives, not with drama, but quietly. It comes somewhere in the middle years of a long relationship, or perhaps at its end, when you are looking back and trying to understand what happened. It is the sense that you loved someone, that you genuinely loved them, and yet something essential was missing, something you cannot quite name. Most people who have been in a long relationship, a marriage, a partnership lasting years or decades, have felt this. Not the obvious crises, not the dramatic betrayals that make for clean explanations, but a softer, harder to locate difficulty. The feeling that two people who care for each other are somehow, quietly, not quite reaching each other. We tend to interpret this feeling as evidence, as proof that the love was not quite right, or not quite enough. We reach for the romantic vocabulary we were given. The spark faded, we grew apart, we wanted different things. These phrases are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They describe symptoms without examining the cause. The cause, in most cases, is not the absence of love. It is the absence of skill. That is a strange sentence to sit with. We are not accustomed to thinking of love as something that requires skill. We tend to think of it as something that either happens to you or does not. As a feeling that either stays or fades. As chemistry, destiny, luck. The kind of thing you find, or lose, or perhaps never deserved in the first place. But consider for a moment what you believe about other important things in life. You do not expect to play a musical instrument well without practice. You do not expect to build something with your hands without learning the craft. You do not expect to be good at your work on the first day. We accept that most things worth doing require effort, learning, and repeated failure before they become fluent. And yet with love, perhaps the most demanding and important of all human endeavors, we largely expect it to be self-sustaining. We expect that if the love is real, it will carry itself forward. That the right feeling will generate the right behavior. That two people who genuinely want to be together will simply find their way, because wanting it enough is the same as knowing how. It is not. This episode is about what love actually requires. Not the beginning of love, the easy part, the part that culture prepares us for lavishly. But the continuation of love. The sustained, daily, often quiet work of remaining genuinely close to another human being across years of change, difficulty, ordinary life, and the slow transformation of who each of you is becoming. This is not a conversation about fixing relationships or about saving what is broken. It is a quieter inquiry about why the most important skill most people will ever need, the skill of loving someone well, over a long time, is almost never taught. About what that skill actually consists of, and about what becomes possible when we begin to understand love not as something that happens to us, but as something we are always, in some sense, choosing to practice. There is a kind of love that is recognized, not just felt. That looks at another person and, across all the changes and ordinary difficulties of a shared life, says, "I see you. I am still here. I am still paying attention." That kind of love does not arrive by accident. It is built, and it is worth understanding how. For most of human history, love and marriage were separate conversations. Marriage was, above almost everything else, a practical arrangement. It organized property, secured alliances between families, and provided the economic foundation for raising children. The feelings involved were real, affection, loyalty, sometimes deep tenderness, but they were not, in most cultures and most centuries, the primary reason two people were joined together. This is not a romantic way to describe the past, but it is an honest one. The transformation began gradually, somewhere in the 17th and 18th centuries in Western Europe, and accelerated dramatically through the 19th century. The idea that love, romantic love, passionate and chosen, freely entered, should be the foundation of marriage was genuinely radical. It meant that individuals could, and should, choose their partners based on feeling rather than family arrangement or economic necessity. It meant that the inner life mattered, that the heart had authority. This was a profound and genuinely liberating shift. It opened possibilities that most previous generations could not imagine. It placed human feeling at the center of the most significant bond most people would ever form. It insisted that something intangible, connection, chemistry, mutual recognition, was worth more than social advantage. But it also introduced a new set of problems. The romantic model is exquisite at explaining the beginning of love. The attraction, the recognition, the intensity of early closeness. These experiences are real, and the culture that built up around them, the novels, the songs, the films, captured something true about them. When two people fall in love, there is a particular quality of attention, of seeing and being seen, that is among the most vivid experiences human life offers. What the romantic model is far less equipped to explain is what happens next. Because that quality of attention does not sustain itself automatically. The early intensity of love is, in part, a biological event, a surge of particular neurochemical states that are genuinely altered states, different from the ordinary texture of daily life. And they do not, in most cases, continue at the same pitch for decades. They settle, they deepen, or thin, or transform. They become something else. The romantic model has almost nothing to say about that something else. It has only one vocabulary for the continuation of love. It either persists, which proves the love was real, or it fades, which proves it was not. There is no word, in popular romantic culture, for the quiet love that exists between two people who have been through enormous amounts together, who know each other past pretense, who do not need intensity to demonstrate depth. There is no cultural narrative for love that has moved beyond euphoria into something steadier and more honest. In 1956, a philosopher and psychologist named Erich Fromm published a small book called The Art of Loving. He wrote that in the modern West, people had confused the experience of falling in love with the ongoing practice of loving, and that this confusion was the source of enormous unnecessary suffering. He argued, simply and precisely, that love was not primarily a feeling. It was an activity, an art, something requiring the same qualities as any serious pursuit: patience, discipline, concentration, and the willingness to stay with difficulty. Fromm was not arguing against feeling. He was arguing that feeling was not enough, that you could feel love genuinely and still be unskilled at it. That the failure of most long relationships was not, at root, a failure of love, it was a failure of preparation. He published that book almost 70 years ago. The culture, by and large, did not update. We still prepare people for the beginning of love with extraordinary thoroughness. The songs, the stories, the films, the cultural rituals, all of it maps the terrain of falling in love with great care. And almost none of it prepares people for what loving someone actually requires once the falling has stopped. This is not a small gap. It is the gap in which most of the difficulty of long relationships lives. The place where two people who genuinely love each other find themselves at a loss, not because the love is gone, but because nobody gave them the tools to sustain it. What would it have meant to be taught about love the way we are taught about other important arts? To understand, from early on, that closeness requires practice, that repair requires courage, that staying curious about someone you think you already know is itself a form of devotion? The world might look somewhat different. But we were not taught that. Most of us were given a beautiful story about the beginning of love, and then left to figure out the rest on our own. There is a moment many people share, though they rarely discuss it. It is the moment when the early intensity of a relationship has settled, not vanished, but changed, and a quiet question arrives. Is this still love? Is this what it was supposed to feel like? There is nothing dramatic about this moment. There is no event, no crisis, no revelation. Only a kind of muted uncertainty. A sense that something has shifted in a way that is hard to name. For some people, this moment passes. They accept the shift without grief, understanding instinctively that what they have now is different from what they had, but not less. For others, it persists. It becomes a background question that does not go away. It shapes decisions, conversations, silences. And for too many people, it eventually becomes a verdict. This is not love, or at least not love enough. Here is what is rarely considered in that verdict. The question itself, is this still love? Assumes that love is primarily felt, and that its presence or absence is revealed by the quality of a feeling. But what if the right question is not whether the feeling has changed, but whether the practice has kept pace with the relationship as it evolved? Consider what happens in a long relationship when small ruptures go unrepaired. Every relationship has friction, misunderstandings, small disappointments, moments of feeling unseen or unheard. These are not signs of failure. They are the normal texture of two distinct people sharing a life. What matters, what genuinely separates relationships that endure from relationships that do not, is not the frequency of these moments, but what happens after them. When a rupture is repaired, acknowledged, understood, forgiven in some genuinely embodied way, it leaves almost no trace. The relationship moves forward, carrying the weight of what was worked through, which is a different kind of ballast from the weight of what was avoided. But when small ruptures are not repaired, when they are buried under the pressure of ordinary life, when they accumulate in silences and careful avoidances, they change the texture of the relationship over time. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but steadily. John Gottman, a psychologist who spent decades studying couples in his laboratory at the University of Washington, identified something he called the repair attempt, a bid, small or large, to reconnect after a rupture. To acknowledge that something went wrong and to reach back toward the other person. His research suggested that the ability to make and receive these bids was more predictive of a relationship's health than the intensity of a couple's disagreements, or even the apparent compatibility of their personalities. Couples who could repair, who had developed, often without consciously knowing it, the habit of returning after conflict, could weather much larger difficulties than couples who could not. The repairs did not need to be eloquent. They did not need to resolve everything. What mattered was the willingness to make them at all. The small gesture of return. What this suggests is that the slow drift many people experience in long relationships, the quiet accumulation of distance, the sense of living alongside someone rather than with them, is often not a function of love disappearing. It is a function of repair not happening, of bids for connection being missed or not made, of an implicit belief that time together is the same thing as closeness, when in fact closeness requires something more active. Think of someone who worked hard, gave what they knew how to give, was faithful and responsible and present in the practical sense of the word. And yet, at the end of decades, looked across the table at their partner and felt a distance they could not account for. Not resentment, not betrayal, just distance, a gap that had grown so slowly they had not noticed it forming. This is not a story about bad people. It is a story about people who were given a model of love that told them feeling was the thing to tend to, and did not tell them what else love required. Gottman also identified something that he found remarkable in its predictive power: the presence of contempt. Not disagreement, not frustration, not even anger, but contempt. The quiet dismissal of another person's inner world as unworthy of serious engagement. He found that couples in which contempt appeared regularly, in tone, in small gestures, in the texture of daily interaction, were on a very particular trajectory. Not because contempt was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of attention. It was the signal that you had stopped being curious about the person in front of you, had stopped taking them seriously as a fully human presence. The cost of all this is real, not only to the relationships that ended, but to the people inside relationships that persist, technically, logistically, dutifully, while the genuine closeness they once offered has been quietly allowed to thin. That cost is largely invisible. It is not counted in any statistics. It is not discussed in the conversations people have with their children, or their friends, or themselves. But it is among the most common forms of private unhappiness in ordinary life. So what does love actually require? It is worth sitting with this question slowly, because the honest answer is more demanding than most people expect, and also more learnable than most people assume. The first thing it requires is attention. Real attention. not the physical proximity of two people living in the same house, but the practiced willingness to actually look at the person in front of you. To notice who they are now, today, in this particular chapter of their life. This sounds simple, and it is extraordinary how rarely it happens. One of the peculiar difficulties of a long relationship is that familiarity, the deep, accumulated knowledge of another person, can begin to function as a replacement for seeing them. You know them. You know how they take their coffee, which subjects agitate them, what their silences mean. This knowledge is real, and it is one of the genuine gifts of long companionship. But it can also become a kind of sediment, a way of relating to who someone was, rather than who they are becoming. People change. They change across decades in ways that are gradual enough to be invisible, and then one day you realize that the person sitting across from you has views, fears, and desires that do not quite map onto the person you believed you knew. This is not a problem. It is simply the reality of two distinct human lives running alongside each other across time. But it requires something in response, the willingness to keep looking. To stay curious. Curiosity is the second thing love requires. Not the curiosity of early attraction, the urgent, anxious interest in someone new, but a quieter, more deliberate curiosity. The choice to ask questions when you could assume answers. To notice that something has changed in the person you are with, and to ask about it rather than fit it into an existing story. Erich Fromm described the most essential act of love as the act of knowing another person, not superficially, but at the level of their interiority. What they hope for, what they are afraid of, what they are still trying to become. He argued that this kind of knowing required active effort, and that the failure to keep seeking it, to keep asking, was itself a form of abandonment, however invisible. The third thing love requires is patience. Not passive tolerance, but the active willingness to remain present with difficulty rather than withdrawing from it. To allow conflict to exist without immediately resolving it on your own terms. To sit with the discomfort of someone else's reality without rushing to make it comfortable or correctable. This is harder than it sounds, because the instinct in most close relationships, when someone you love is struggling, or angry, or afraid, is to fix. To solve. To make the uncomfortable thing go away. And sometimes that is the right response. But sometimes what the other person most needs is not a solution. It is the experience of being held in their difficulty, of not being alone in it, of mattering enough that someone will stay without fleeing toward answers. The fourth thing love requires is repair. Gottman's research kept pointing here, across every variation of couple and culture he studied. The willingness to return, to acknowledge, with genuine humility, when you have been wrong, or unkind, or absent in some way that matters. To make the bid to reconnect after a rupture, even awkwardly, even incompletely. To resist the temptation, so common, so human, to let silence replace the conversation that feels too difficult to start. Repair is a skill. Like any skill, it improves with practice. And like any skill, the longer you go without practicing it, the harder it becomes to begin. Couples who have not repaired in years have a structural difficulty on their hands, not because love is gone, but because the pathway back to closeness has grown unfamiliar. The pathway can be reopened, but it requires someone to be willing to try, and to be willing to look clumsy doing it. The fifth thing love requires is perhaps the most demanding: clarity. The willingness to see the person you love accurately, not as you wish them to be, not as you fear them to be, but as they actually are. With their actual limitations, their actual needs, their actual ways of moving through the world. This is different from acceptance, though it includes acceptance. It is the choice to love what is genuinely there, rather than the idealized projection that most of us, at the beginning of love, mistake for the real person. Early love tends to involve a degree of idealization that is not dishonest, exactly, but that is certainly incomplete. The other person is seen through a particular light, their best angles emphasized, their difficulties softened or overlooked. This is natural. It is also, if it persists without revision, a slow form of disappointment waiting to happen. Seeing someone clearly, without the distortion of idealization, but also without the distortion of accumulated grievance, requires something that is genuinely difficult: the willingness to extend to another person the same reasonable tolerance for limitation that you would like extended to yourself. To hold the awareness that this person, like you, is doing the best they know how with the tools they have. To love the actual person, rather than the story you have constructed about them. None of these things are instincts. None of them arrive naturally, without cultivation. They are, as Fromm insisted, an art. And like all arts, they can be approached as such, with seriousness, with humility, with the understanding that effort is not the enemy of love, but its most honest expression. There is something worth pausing on here. These 5 qualities, attention, curiosity, patience, repair, clarity, are not extraordinary virtues. They are ordinary human capacities. Most people have some version of all of them, in some area of their lives. The question is not whether you possess them. The question is whether you have directed them toward the most important relationship in your life, with the same care and deliberateness you might bring to your work, or your craft, or the things you most want to do well. That is a question most of us have not been asked. There is a kind of love that does not announce itself. It is not the love of the first months, when everything about another person is a discovery and your attention is pulled toward them by a force that feels almost involuntary. That love is real, and it is one of the experiences life offers most generously. But it is not, in the end, what people mean when they describe someone who has loved another person well across the span of a life. The love that deserves that description is quieter. It is built in smaller acts, repeated across years. A conversation started, rather than avoided. A question asked rather than assumed. A moment of conflict met with patience rather than contempt. A return, even when returning is harder than staying away. A hand placed on a shoulder in a gesture so practiced it is no longer conscious, but is, for that very reason, more honest than anything effortful could be. This kind of love does not require the absence of difficulty. It is not proof against loss, or fear, or the countless small disappointments that a shared life accumulates over decades. It does not prevent the grief of watching someone change, or the particular loneliness of being known imperfectly, even by the person who knows you best. What it does offer is something different: the experience of not being alone in the full, unromantic sense of that word. Not just companionship in good moments, but a witnessed life. Someone who has been present for the chapters you would rather forget, who has seen you in your worst and most diminished states, and has, still, stubbornly, with full information, chosen to stay. That is an extraordinary thing. And it does not happen by accident. It happens through the practice of all the things we have been considering in this episode. Through the decision, made over and over, to keep paying attention. To keep asking, rather than assuming. To repair rather than accumulate. To hold someone clearly, rather than retreating into a projection. These decisions do not need to be dramatic. Most of the time, they are barely visible. A moment of patience instead of impatience. A question instead of a conclusion. A willingness to begin the conversation you have been putting off. It is worth saying plainly that not every relationship should be preserved. Some relationships have genuine incompatibilities that no amount of skill can bridge. Some people grow in directions that cannot be reconciled. And some relationships end honestly, with both people carrying their share of the grief, recognizing that what they had was real, and that its ending is also real. But a great number of relationships end not because love failed, but because skill was absent. Because two people who genuinely cared for each other never learned how to repair what broke, or how to stay curious about who the other person was becoming, or how to make the small daily bids for connection that keep closeness alive. They ran out of the model they were given, and were not given another. Understanding this does not rewrite the past. It does not restore what has been lost. But it changes what is possible going forward. For people still inside long relationships, it offers a different set of questions than the culture typically provides. Not whether the feeling is what it used to be, but whether the practice is what it could become. Fromm ended his small book with a thought that has stayed with many readers across the decades. He wrote that love is not a restful place. It is an activity and an active faith. That it requires the same quality of courage as any other form of genuine engagement with the difficult reality of another human being. Perhaps the deepest truth about love is this: it is not something that happens to you once and then either stays or leaves. It is something you are always, in some small way, choosing, or declining, to practice. And the quality of that practice, over years and decades, determines not only the shape of your most important relationships, but the kind of person you become inside them. That is not a reason for discouragement. It is a reason for something closer to hope. Because if love is a skill, then it is something that can always be returned to. Something that can be practiced more carefully, more deliberately, with more patience than yesterday. The deepest love is not the most felt. It is the most sustained. And sustaining it, choosing it, day after day, with all the attention and patience and honesty that choice requires, is among the most quietly remarkable things a human life can contain.